Hello everyone, my name is Andrew Urkamp and I'm the editor of Grandin Media. Thank you, Your Grace, for taking the time to speak to us today and for the opportunity for this teaching moment. Today we're discussing an open letter signed by more than 50 religious leaders from a variety of faiths in opposition to Bill C-7, which amends Canada's assisted suicide law. Among the signatories is the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. Assisted suicide is legal in 10 countries, including Canada, since 2016. Based on available data, there were 6,749 medically assisted deaths in Canada between legislative enactment and October 31st, 2018. As recently as October 20th of this year, the Parliamentary Budget Office estimates that medically assisted deaths could increase by 1,200 next year. Bill C-7 would ease the restrictions on assisted suicide. It would eliminate the requirement that a person's death must be reasonably foreseeable before they qualify for assisted suicide, which is called medical assistance in dying in law. The federal government says the changes are necessary so that the current law falls in line with a Quebec court ruling which said the reasonable foreseeability of natural death was unconstitutional because it was too restrictive. The first question, what is the Church's teaching on assisted suicide, and what should everyone, our Catholic community in particular, know about Bill C-7?
Well, first of all, thanks for doing this. This bill now is before the federal government. It's the second time it's come before. I think they introduced an update to the assisted suicide euthanasia legislation in February, following that Truchon decision, as you mentioned. And because eventually Parliament was prorogued, now they're reintroducing it. And every time that this comes up, the bishops want to speak, precisely because, as you say, of what we teach about this. What you just highlighted in terms of statistics is a terrible, shameful legacy for this country. It represents, in my view, a massive failure of compassion. We have somehow been moving away in our mindset and in our mentality with respect to care for the suffering, care for the dying, moved away from caring and compassion and accompanying and honoring the dignity of human life until it's natural, and moved away from that to responding to suffering by killing. I mean, how did we ever get to that? Assisted suicide and euthanasia is the taking of human life. Prior to these changes in the criminal code, it was very clearly stated there that this is an act of homicide. We still hold to that. No one has the right to presume such total control over their own life, or even to step in this act of control over another's life as to take it. That we just do not have that right. God is the author of life, and it is God alone who guides life, and we need to be respecting that in every way. So, when this latest reintroduction of the bill came up, now called C-7, I think it was originally too, the bishops felt the need to speak. And not just the bishops, as you said, we're signatories to this interreligious statement, and accompanying which we now have a distinct statement from the CCCB, outlining, first of all, in no uncertain terms, that the Church is radically opposed, without any qualification, to assisted suicide and euthanasia. So whenever there is an attempt to legislate it into being, and whenever there is an attempt to expand access to it through legislation, we're going to be there and we want to speak, and that's what we're doing now. And beyond that, we're also asking all of our people to speak, and to let the government know that this is simply not acceptable. It's not acceptable to us as believers. And we would hold that in a democratic society that holds to the common good, neither is it acceptable in that context. It undermines law, it undermines family, it undermines human dignity, it undermines the medical profession by introducing the possibility of distrust between a patient and the physician. So this is seeking to expand access to euthanasia and assisted suicide even beyond the accessibility that was originally established when the bill first came into place in 2016. There had been so-called safeguards put in place there, one of which was to say that the death of the individual must be reasonably foreseeable. Well, that was struck down as unconstitutional by the Truchon decision. And rather than appeal that decision, as we hold the government should have done, they just decided to accept it and move it forward, undermining in the process what that original legislation had said about the need 5 years out from the original legislation to have some meaningful consultation about how this is all unfolding before anything further were to take place. That's now been undercut by this failure to appeal the bill. But the bill goes beyond even removing that safeguard of reasonably foreseeable, and by removing it, saying that now the law allowing assisted suicide, euthanasia, these practices are now open and accessible to people who are not dying. Well, understandably, that brings to the fore great, great concern for the disabled, for the vulnerable, people that have a whole host of different issues with their health and so on. And for that reason, we've had disability advocates speak out against this bill. There's a group of medical officers, doctors, who have recently spoken out against this expansion. And so the bishops are uniting with these groups and saying, hit the pause button. Do the dialogue, do the consultation that must take place, and do it in a meaningful way. Now, the government has been saying that prior to the earlier introduction of this new bill in February, I think it was, there had been a consultation of the people. Well, excuse me, it was no meaningful consultation. 2 weeks. 2 weeks, which involved questions worded in such a way that it presumed acceptance of euthanasia and assisted suicide as something good. Well, excuse me, there are many people that do not accept this as something good. If there's going to be consultation, and there must be, let it be meaningful, let it be prolonged, let it be such that everyone is able to offer their perspective, and such that everybody is able to take a good, sober look at not only what has been unfolding in the past, but where it's leading. Now, you mentioned earlier the report of the Parliamentary Budget Office with some statistics about numbers of death. What that statement also includes, as I understand from media reports, is an assessment of how many dollars are being saved in the healthcare system by having assisted suicide and euthanasia rather than the accompaniment for however long is necessary of the person in their need, right? Many people have said from the outset that as long as there is assisted suicide and euthanasia, and as long as the safeguards keep getting progressively removed, the pressure on people to accept assisted suicide and euthanasia as a way to deal with their suffering will only increase. And one of the pressures that inevitably will be there is the financial one. Right? We have aging populations, right? And they are going to absorb many of those healthcare dollars. Great pressures on governments today, right, to constrain their budgets. And it wouldn't be much of a stretch for people to say, here are some ways in which savings can take place. It would not be much of a stretch for insurance companies to say, here is where some money can be saved. And in fact, we know, long before legislation came to the fore here in Canada, it was legal in some states south of the border in America. We've heard where insurance companies would say to somebody who was recently diagnosed with cancer and needed an expensive drug for treatment, well, no, we will not cover the cost of that drug, but we will cover the cost of your assisted suicide. So there we have the pressure being put out on the people who are sick from just a financial perspective alone. So this is a perilous time in many ways. And I really do fear, and the bishops do fear, that we have a government right now which is just rolling along with this juggernaut and allowing themselves to be pushed forward by it and increasing the accessibility to this practice without the consultation and without the meaningful dialogue that needs to take place among the citizens of this land. So we want people to be speaking up. Assisted suicide and euthanasia in and of itself is wrong, it's immoral, it isn't, it should not be happening. Hit the pause button. Make sure that people get as long as it does exist, make sure that people get meaningful, sure safeguards. Make sure we're listening to people. And of course, make sure that those in the healthcare profession that have substantive, conscious-based objections to participating in this have their freedom to object, conscientious objection, upheld.
Is the fear then that assisted suicide will become much more commonplace rather than a rarity in certain situations?
Yeah, and that would be a well-founded fear. We just need to look at countries in the European Union that have allowed this long before Canada did. And I believe it is, now I could stand to be corrected in terms of the countries, either Belgium or the Netherlands that I read in the news not too long ago, that is recently contemplating opening up access even to children below the age of 12. It's just, once the door is opened, it just gets progressively opened. And if we were to go back and re-examine the Carter decision that opened the door for this to happen, the wording in that is such that you can just see where the safeguards will eventually be falling away as a logical progression from the statements that were made in that original decision.
The church and the state define mercy differently. Can you address those differences? And what, Your Grace, what would you counsel others to do when faced with a situation in which a loved one is suffering terribly, and the family or some in the family are considering assisted suicide as an option?
Well, first of all, in terms of the word mercy, I think what we need to keep in mind is that mercy can never be separated from truth. Right? Obviously, we want to do what is caring, loving, merciful when we see someone who's suffering before us. When we separate that, though, from truth, then we start to cross boundaries that we ought not to cross. And the truth is that human life is a gift. We are but stewards. We are not masters of this. And if we forget that particular truth, then we step over that line and presume to become our own masters. And that's where we get into confusion of terminology, confusion of action. Same thing with respect to compassion. I mean, just the word compassion itself means suffering with. And so the church from the beginning has always been with the suffering and wanting to walk with them and to heal them, comfort them, console them, and so on. But that means, as our Lord did with us on the cross, assume the suffering also ourselves, walk with, suffer with, and in this way really demonstrate to the individual our love for them, our respect for the dignity of their human nature, and so on. And that, I think, would also link with your second question about what we would communicate, what I would communicate to families, and what suggests that the families communicate to their loved one. And the way that I often phrase it is, the person is always a gift, never a burden. And the reason I say it is that statistics will tell us that among the top reasons that people will choose to ask for assisted suicide and euthanasia is that they worry that they might become a burden to their loved ones. They worry that perhaps they have become a burden to their loved ones, or frankly, sometimes they will receive from their loved ones the suggestion that maybe they are becoming a burden. We cannot feed into that. A person that I love is always a gift and never a burden. And their suffering will indeed place upon me a burden in the sense of it calls me out of myself to care for that person, to put that person ahead of my own needs. But that becomes a burden or labor of love. It's not something to avoid or to try to put aside. Certainly not a burden that I try to put aside by putting the person aside through euthanasia or assisted suicide. So understand compassion and mercy in connection with truth, and let that truth inform us of the beauty and the inherent dignity of each and every human person that cannot be taken away, that must not be allowed to be obscured by any particular circumstance. Always a gift, never a burden.
Right. What's the alternative to assisted suicide? Is it palliative care, and what should the government, in the bishop's view, be doing to increase palliative care or options for families who may be considering assisted suicide and are looking for an alternative to that?
Yeah. The church has long advocated for this for many, many years. The church, together with many, many other people. And again, anecdotally, we know that many people, when they have these different options presented to them for their care, palliative care that will actually ease the burden of pain, palliative care that will surround them with a sense of their own dignity, of their own worth, of their own giftedness and lovableness, that they're a palliative care that can help bust a lot of the myths that I have to endure unendurable pain and these sorts of things. If you look at pain management specialists, they'll tell us very clearly, pain can be managed, to help people through these things. So palliative care surrounds them with love, it surrounds them with the truth of their dignity, and the more people become aware of the possibility of this palliative relief, walking with and helping to come, the less that they want to choose these things. Now, the challenge before us in Canada is that we do have inequality of access to good quality palliative care. My understanding is that where it does exist, it's good. Our experience here in Edmonton, which is largely led by the Catholic healthcare system, Covenant Health has its own Palliative Care Institute, which is a world leader in research into palliative care and so on. So here in this area, most of the palliative care beds would be offered by Catholic healthcare, and it's of excellent quality. And we're doing everything that we can to advance research into how it can be even better and improved. When you move out into the rural areas, I think it's a little bit more patchy. And that's why we've been advocating, together with many others for a long while now, to the federal government. And they've had their successive palliative care strategies that they've put together. How well they've unfolded, I'm not so sure. But on the ground right now, we still have to have broader access to excellent quality palliative care. I guess the final point to make in relationship to this is we need to be aware of how people will try to conflate terms. So I've heard some suggest that palliative care is sort of part of the medical assistance in dying. Palliative care, therefore, should be part of what a hospice would offer. And we're saying, no. Assisted suicide, euthanasia, absolutely different from palliative care. Let's not confuse them. And I think part of the confusion, a great deal of the confusion, probably comes from this legal terminology that we're using. Medical assistance in dying. That's very misleading. That's very vague. In one sense, the church has always assisted people in the dying process. We've always been there with them to assist them, never to hasten the death. Assisted suicide hastens death deliberately and therefore properly falls within that category of homicide. Palliative care is very, very different. It doesn't hasten death, but assists. But as long as we have this rather vague terminology of medical assistance in dying, it lends itself to this confusion and this conflation. And we need to be really, really careful to keep them distinct.
The open letter is signed by more than 50 religious leaders from across the country. Is the opposition to expansion of assisted suicide based on religion? And what would you say to those who don't share those values in particular?
Clearly, a lot of the opposition would arise out of our own faith and our own appreciation in faith of the dignity of the human person created in the image and likeness of God. But there are many people, even of no faith, that can look at this and say, we can do better than this as a society. And people that will look at this and say, all right, what are we doing, even apart from a faith perspective, in allowing assisted suicide and euthanasia that in fact is going to cause to unravel those threads that we need as a society to preserve the common good. And one of those fundamental threads that people of faith or no faith have always upheld is that we don't solve our problems by killing one another. We don't respond to suffering by killing the one who is suffering, right? We want to end the suffering, but not the sufferer. But this fundamental respect for life and this fundamental understanding that there's a line that we ought not to cross has always been at the basis of our legal system. It's always been at the basis of our medical system. If all of a sudden we are saying, both medically and legally, that this is possible, then those two fundamental institutions that our society writ large has always relied upon as trustworthy bastions of the common good, as trustworthy cells that keep us all together, those get undermined. Right? And the other thing that gets undermined in the process is the family. Because this introduces into family dynamics extraordinary hardship and deep division. Society needs the family to be unified. Whether you're a person of faith or not a person of faith, we get that. We need the family to be a strong unit. This causes the family to dissipate in ways that are so deeply harmful that the family may not be able to come back together. So even from a non-faith perspective, we can look at this objectively, see what the consequences of such a law will be to the common good, and be motivated just by reason alone to stand up and say, this must not be. Hit that pause button.
The letter is entitled, We Can and Must Do Much Better, and it includes a call to action. What does that call to action look like in your view? And also, is it not too late since assisted suicide has been legal since 2016?
Right. Well, two things. In terms of call to action, we need to be prepared to set aside some time and give some effort to meaningful contact to the members of Parliament. When I say meaningful, I mean a form of contact that will get them to stand up, take notice, and be effective. So we can take a rather easy route of signing petitions, putting in form letters, but I think our elected officials see those for what they are. If someone takes the time to go down to the constituency office and knock on the door, we need to talk. If somebody takes the time to handwrite a letter and say, I'm opposed to this, stop it, that's what catches their attention. But it demands of us that we be deliberate about that and take the time in order to do it. Whether or not it's too late, it's never too late. I mean, we have, and I'll go back now to our identity as Catholic people. We have a responsibility to give witness. Whenever there's an opportunity to give witness to the dignity of human life, we must give it. Whenever we see threats to the dignity of life, we have to speak. All right. And we also do it in the context of the mystery of the church, knowing that when we do what we must in virtue of our faith, do what we must in virtue of the simple fact that we're human beings, and give that over to the Lord, He'll take that in directions that perhaps we can't even imagine, in ways that would astonish us and astound us. We may feel powerless and limited before such a powerful force as the federal government, against all the different forces moving and operating through society to advance assisted suicide and euthanasia, that would be far more politically savvy, far more politically powerful than we are. But nothing is more powerful than God. Nothing, right? And He can change anything. So it's out of that conviction in God's power, not of our own capacity, that we speak and we act and give it over to Him.
Your Grace, thank you very much for this
You're
time.
welcome. You're welcome.